A lie unspoken can be louder than the truth. Welcome to Wired Script Den. I am your host, Denora. This community is incredible. Comment where you're tuning in from. Your voices make this journey special. Let's begin the silent alibi. I've never been one to pretend that living with Nero Wolfe is easy. Sharing a roof with a man who thinks climbing a single flight of stairs constitutes an athletic achievement, and who regards the human race as mostly inconvenient, except when they bring him orchids or food, isn't something you slip into without adjustments. But when you've stuck it out as long as I have, the rhythm of it gets baked into your bones, which is why I knew right away that the woman who rang our doorbell that Tuesday morning was going to be trouble. Not because she looked like trouble. She didn't. If anything, she looked like the sort of person you'd expect to be in line at the public library at 10 in the morning. Sensible suit, hair pinned in place, no perfume that I could detect. What set my antennae twitching was the way she insisted on coming in without waiting for me to offer. Some people ask permission, others assume they've already got it. She was in the second category. "Mr. Wolfe will see me," she said, brushing past me into the front room like she owned the place. "That's what you think," I told her, moving to block the hall that leads to the office. "Mr. Wolfe doesn't see anyone before he decides to. And believe me, you're not on today's calendar." She turned those steady grey eyes on me, and for the first time I noticed they were the kind of eyes that don't blink when challenged. "Then tell him my name, Miriam Kerrigan, and tell him I've brought him a case he cannot refuse." I had a choice there, toss her out or let her bluff ride. Since Wolfe was upstairs with his orchids, and I had 2 hours before he'd come down, I let her sit in the front room while I sized her up. The silence stretched until she decided to break it. "This isn't about money," she said. "It's about reputation. And I don't mean mine. I mean his. That got me. Wolfe's reputation isn't something you just toss on the coffee table like a magazine. It's the one sacred cow in this brownstone besides the orchids and Fritz's veal ragout." "Lady," I said, "if you're about to accuse Wolfe of stealing your umbrella, you can take it to the precinct down the block." "I'm accusing no one," she said, "but I'm here because something has been stolen. And if it's not found, then by tonight someone will use Nero Wolfe's name as their alibi." She had me then. Wolfe didn't like being baited, but if she was dangling his own name as the hook, there was no way I could just shrug and tell her to scram. So when Wolfe came down at 11 sharp, settling into the red leather chair like a Roman emperor back from campaign, I delivered Miriam Kerrigan and her line about a stolen item and a borrowed alibi. He looked at her once, long enough to memorize her down to the stitching of her hem, and then closed his eyes. "Pfui," he said. "Archie, bring beer. And then Miss Kerrigan may begin her absurdity." And just like that, the brownstone was disturbed. "Would you like me to continue directly into Section 2? The brownstone disturbed, where outsiders, the client and perhaps an unexpected visitor, pull Wolfe deeper into the case. Or do you want to pause and refine the setup first?" Miriam Kerrigan sat there like she was auditioning for the role of woman who refuses to sweat under pressure. Wolfe had just given her the ceremonial "fui" and instructed me to fetch the beer, which I did because my contract with life in the brownstone requires me to act as both errand boy and witness to human folly. By the time I set the glass on Wolfe's desk, foaming just the way he likes, he had already leaned back, lids at half-mast, the picture of an immovable mountain waiting for weather to change. "Now," Wolfe said, his voice steady and dry, "you have insinuated my name will be commandeered to furnish an alibi." "An alibi for what?" Miriam Kerrigan folded her hands over the plain leather bag in her lap. Her lips tightened for a moment, as if she was considering whether to start at the shallow end or throw us straight into the deep. "For theft," she said. "Theft of a file." "Fui," Wolfe repeated, although softer, like he was saving the louder edition for something more deserving. I leaned against the globe in the corner, which I've always thought was more decorative than practical, since Wolfe doesn't travel farther than the dining room. "Lady," I said, "people misplace umbrellas, cash, even the occasional lover. But a file? Nobody storms into a stranger's office to make headlines out of stolen stationery. You'd better put some meat on the bones." "It's not stationery," she said firmly. "It's a file belonging to Grant Harwood. She stopped, looked at Wolfe, then back at me. "He's a client of mine." "I'm an attorney." Wolfe opened one eye. "Then the theft is of a legal nature." "The file contains a deposition draft," she said. Unfiled but explosive. If it were to be leaked, it could ruin Mr. Harwood's case, his business, and several people around him. And if it isn't returned, tonight Mr. Harwood is prepared to say he was with you, Mr. Wolfe, at the exact hour the file went missing, which he was not. I admit that last part dropped in my ears like a cymbal crash. I turned to Wolfe, waiting to see if he'd twitch an eyebrow, but he didn't even clear his throat. I have never met this Mr. Harwood, Wolfe said. No, Miriam said, but he intends to use your reputation as his shield. Because you don't leave this house, no one would question his claim that he was with you here at the time in question. He believes it's airtight. I gave her a grin that wasn't exactly friendly. So instead of going to the police, you decided to come warn us that some slick operator wants to borrow Wolfe's good name, without asking. Warn you and retain you, she said, because if Harwood does use your name, questions will circle back here. Your sanctuary will be violated. You'll be pulled into the matter, whether you want to or not. Better to have the truth in hand before that happens. That line about sanctuary wasn't an accident. I could see it hit Wolfe like a note struck on one of his orchid's fragile stems. He kept his gaze closed, but his breathing deepened just a notch. He didn't like strangers in his house at the best of times, and the idea of his name being bandied about in police stations as an alibi was enough to curdle his beer. Why? Wolfe asked finally. Have you not confronted your client? I have, she said. He insists he knows nothing of the missing file. But I'm not naive. The only reason he would invoke your name is if he, or someone close to him, was desperate. And desperate people can be dangerous. I need you to uncover the truth. I gave Wolfe the side-eye. He hadn't moved. He hadn't even taken a sip of the beer. It sat there sweating on the desk, untouched. When he lets the beer sweat, it means his brain is pulling more current than usual. Miss Kerrigan, Wolfe said, you are a lawyer. Presumably you possess a retainer agreement, contracts, fiduciary duties. Why do you come to me rather than enlisting the proper authorities? Because, she said, leaning forward for the first time, I don't want this to become public. If the police get involved, the story becomes part of the record. And Harwood is wealthy, connected, and well-liked. If I move against him without certainty, I'll be destroyed professionally. If you uncover the truth quietly, I can act from a position of strength. Now she had played her card. Wolfe doesn't like leaving the house, but he does enjoy exposing liars. I could see him weighing her words. Archie, he said suddenly, get Saul. That perked me up. Wolfe doesn't play his Saul Panzer card unless he smells smoke under the floorboards. You want Saul here? I asked. On the telephone, Wolfe said, gesturing faintly with his finger. Not here. Not yet. I moved to the phone and dialed Saul's number, filling him in with a brisk sketch. Woman named Kerrigan, stolen file, client using Wolfe's name for cover. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. Saul never does. He just said he'd clear the decks and wait for my call with instructions. By the time I hung up, Wolfe had finally picked up the beer, sipped it, and set it down with a small sigh. To him, beer was like punctuation. Miss Kerrigan, he said, you have intruded upon my morning with a matter both offensive and banal. Offensive because my name has been conscripted without my consent. Banal because theft of papers is as tedious as theft of umbrellas. Nonetheless, Archie will look into this. If there is a missing file, he will find it. If your client has devised an alibi involving me, I will eviscerate it. But be forewarned, my assistance is neither discreet nor inexpensive. She nodded as if she had expected nothing less. I'll pay your fee. Whatever it is. Whatever it is, Wolfe echoed. Though I knew the words were less about the money and more about setting her in his ledger of obligations. After she left, the brownstone felt oddly quieter, as if it had swallowed her tension whole and was digesting it. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closed, lips pressed, while I stretched and looked out the window. Well, I said, I've seen people walk in here with cockamamie tales, but this is the first time someone's worried. You'll be used as an alibi for something you didn't even know was missing. What's next? Somebody claims you were at Belmont betting on the third race. Archie, Wolfe said, spare me your wit. This woman's arrival is not happenstance. The theft of papers is trivial. The invocation of my name is not. You will call on Mr. Harwood. Any particular marching orders? I asked. You will determine whether his theft is genuine, whether his claim of ignorance is pretense, and whether Miss Kerrigan has embroiled me in a quarrel between client and counsellor. And Archie, He opened his eyes now, pinning me with that steady look of his. Observe carefully. Someone will trespass further before this day ends. I would know who. That was Wolfe for you. I hadn't even stepped out the door, and he was already predicting that something else was going to stir up the quiet of the brownstone. He was usually right about these things too. By 2 o'clock, I was downtown in a marble lobby that smelled like brass polish and fear of losing money. Grant Harwood's office occupied the 12th floor, and the receptionist, a brunette with the sort of cheekbones that agencies dream about, announced me as a representative of Mr. Nero Wolfe. That got me ushered in without the usual delays. Harwood himself was behind a desk the size of Wolfe's dinner table. He had a square jaw, the kind you usually only see in barbershop ads, and a suit that screamed money without actually yelling. When he saw me, he rose smiling as if I was a long-lost cousin. "Mr. Goodwin," he said warmly, extending a hand. "How is Wolfe? Still tending orchids?" I didn't bother shaking. I just gave him a level stare. He's still Wolfe, which is why he's not thrilled that you've been advertising him as your personal timekeeper. The smile froze just enough to prove I'd hit the target. He recovered quickly, though. "Surely you don't take gossip seriously." I may have mentioned Wolfe in conversation, but never as an alibi. People exaggerate. "Funny," I said. "Miss Kerrigan didn't seem to think it was gossip. She seemed pretty sure you intended to swear by Wolfe's housebound habits to cover your tracks." His eyes narrowed, though the smile didn't completely vanish. "Miriam exaggerates. She's cautious to a fault. If she told you I was planning to involve Wolfe, she's wrong. And if she told you a file was stolen, she's creating drama where none exists." That was interesting. Either he was calling his own lawyer a liar, or he was playing me with the kind of polish you only get from years of boardroom fencing. "Then the file wasn't stolen?" I asked. He shrugged, too casual. "A draft may have been misplaced. That happens. No need to make a federal case of it," which was the sort of line people say right before it does become a federal case. I stayed another 20 minutes, tossing him casual questions and watching him sidestep each one like a boxer circling the ring. By the time I left, I knew 2 things for certain. 1, Harwood was lying about something, and 2, he wasn't half as smooth as he thought he was. Walking back through the lobby, I spotted a man in a brown overcoat reading a newspaper, except he wasn't reading. He was watching me. When I turned sharply toward him, he folded the paper without blinking, rose and strolled out the revolving door without a backward glance, which, of course, meant Wolfe was right. Somebody was trespassing, and not just on paper. I checked my watch, made a note to ring Saul, and headed back uptown. If Harwood wanted to play shadow games with Wolfe's name, he was about to learn the hard way that shadows don't last long under Wolfe's kind of light. "Would you like me to roll straight into the next segment?" Archie digging deeper into the suspects. "Starting to form the circle of suspects, or pause here for refinement before I move forward." When I got back to the brownstone, Fritz was just pulling something fragrant from the oven that smelled like it involved lamb, rosemary, and enough garlic to repel half of Manhattan. I would have gladly hung around the kitchen to angle for a taste, but Wolfe was waiting upstairs in the office, and since I'd just spotted a tail in Harwood's lobby, I figured it was best to deliver the news before the man in the brown coat came. Knocking on our front door, Wolfe had his bulk, planted in the red leather chair like a boulder that had been quarried to fit the exact dimensions of the room. He had a book open on his lap, some thick volume with a title I couldn't pronounce, and he didn't even look up when I came in. "You have something?" he asked, eyes on the page. "2 somethings," I said. "Harwood denies the file was stolen," which is a lie I'd bet Fritz's garlic lamb on. "And someone in a brown overcoat was tailing me when I left his office. He made himself scarce as soon as I turned on him, but the message was clear." That got Wolfe's eyes up. He didn't close the book, but he shifted it slightly as though reminding himself where the real work lay. "Describe him. Medium build, average face, brown coat. The kind of man you'd forget as soon as you looked away. Which makes me think he was either hired for the job or very good at it." "Or both," Wolfe said. "And Harwood?" "Too smooth by half. He tried to call Miriam a liar, claimed she's exaggerating and creating drama. That's one way to build trust with your lawyer. Build trust." Wolfe exhaled through his nose, which in his vocabulary was the equivalent of a bark of laughter. "So we have a file, a lawyer, a client, and now a shadow. The circle widens. Any orders?" I asked. "Yes, sit. When Wolfe tells me to sit, I sit." He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't look commanding. He just drops the word with such weight that you'd think gravity invented itself to keep him happy. I sat. He shut the book at last, placed it neatly on the stand, and laced his fingers over his middle. "Archie, enumerate the dramatis persona," I grinned. "You're asking me to draw up a cast list. Fine, so far we have Miriam Kerrigan, the lawyer who came in here this morning with more backbone than makeup. Grant Harwood, her client who's hiding something under that tailor-made suit. A missing file that everyone claims either doesn't matter or doesn't exist. And Mr. Brown Overcoat, whose job is to make sure curious fellows like me don't poke too deep. That's four. Add yourself," Wolfe said. "Thanks. Always nice to be counted. Do not be frivolous. You are inside the sphere whether you choose it or not. That makes five. There will be others." I leaned back, propping a leg on the corner of the desk. "You think Harwood's lying through his square jaw? Or is Miriam playing us? Both in different degrees. That narrows it down." He ignored me. "Theft of a file is a pedestrian event, Archie. The file's importance lies not in its contents, but in its utility as leverage. Who benefits from its absence? Who benefits from its presumed existence? Until we answer that, we grope in the dark." "Saul?" I asked. "Yes. He is to locate the man in the brown coat quietly. I want to know who watches you and by extension who watches me. Call him." I made the call while Wolfe shut his eyes, already sunk in thought. Saul picked up, listened, and said he'd report back when he had something worth saying. With Saul, that could be tonight or tomorrow, but it would be accurate down to the shoelaces. When I hung up, Wolfe opened his eyes again. "And you, Archie, will speak further with Miss Kerrigan." "What for?" "She already gave us the sob story. To see if her sob story changes when she is pressed. The elasticity of truth is often most revealing." I muttered something unprintable but nodded. At 6 o'clock sharp, Fritz's lamb hit the table, and for 30 minutes the world ceased to exist. Wolfe ate with the solemn focus of a priest performing a sacrament, and I didn't interrupt. Food comes first, life second, and murder or theft somewhere down the list after beer and orchids. After dinner, I rang Miriam Kerrigan and told her Wolfe required her presence again. She didn't balk. She agreed to come by at 8. By the time she arrived, Wolfe was back in the office, fresh beer at his elbow, orchids tended, and patience stretched thinner than the pages of his book. Miriam sat straight-backed, bag in her lap again. Wolfe studied her as if she were an uninvited insect in his conservatory. "Miss Kerrigan," he said, "your client denies the theft." "He claims you are exaggerating." "He claims the file is merely misplaced." Her jaw tightened. "That's impossible. I handled it myself 2 days ago. I left it in his office safe. Then you accuse him of lying. I accuse him of being desperate. He thinks if he denies, the problem disappears. And you brought this to me because I told you this morning. If Harwood insists on dragging you into his cover, you'll be implicated without choice. Better to expose the truth now." "Expose?" Wolfe murmured. "An interesting word. Do you seek truth, Miss Kerrigan, or vindication?" She flinched slightly, but covered it with a shake of her head. "Both, perhaps. I won't pretend otherwise." Wolfe closed his eyes. "Phooey, motive is always plural. But you will answer me this. Who else had access to that file?" She hesitated. "Harwood's business partner, Alan Rodman. Their secretary, Evelyn Marsh, and—" She stopped. "And?" Wolfe prompted. She bit her lip. "His wife. Lila Harwood." I took a mental snapshot of that pause. It wasn't hesitation like she'd forgotten a name. It was hesitation like she'd almost decided to keep it to herself. "Very well," Wolfe said. "Mr. Goodwin will make their acquaintance. Tonight?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning." I refused to be deprived of sleep by such trivia. That ended the session. Miriam left, looking both relieved and burdened, a combination I'd seen before on people who knew they'd handed Wolfe more ammunition than they'd intended. After she was gone, I glanced at Wolfe. "So we've got ourselves a circle of suspects. Partner, secretary, wife, and let's not forget the man himself. Any early favorite?" "Archie," he said. "When you are presented with a plate containing beef, lamb, and chicken, do you declare a favorite before you taste?" "Depends who's cooking," I said. He ignored me again. "You will begin with the partner. Business partners are often more inimical than rivals." "Sure," I said, standing. "And what if Brown Overcoat shows up again tomorrow while I'm nosing around?" "Then Saul will earn his fee." I left him there with his beer and his books, thinking how he had a way of making things sound neat, even when they were about as messy as an alley fight in August. The next morning, I started with Alan Rodman. His office was 2 floors down from Harwood's, all glass walls and steel trim, the kind of modern design meant to convince clients they were dealing with someone younger and sharper than the competition. Rodman himself looked like he'd been poured into his suit a size too small, but he had the kind of easy smile that made you think he enjoyed the squeeze. "Goodwin," he said when I introduced myself, representing Nero Wolfe. "Well, well, what does Wolfe want with us mortals?" "Nothing," I said, "until you tell me where you were 2 nights ago between 8 and 10. That knocked the smile a little off kilter. "That's an odd question. Not if you know the file that disappeared and the alibi Harwood's been shopping around." Rodman sank into his chair, steepling his fingers. "Harwood is a fool if he's dragging Wolfe into this. But if you're asking, yes, I was at the Stuyvesant Club that evening. Playing bridge. 6 people saw me. 12 people. And the file? I had no interest in it. Miriam handles the legal paperwork. I handle finance. I wouldn't know a deposition draft from a grocery list. Maybe. But I'd seen enough businessmen to know when a man was rehearsing his lines. As I left his office, I made a note. Rodman was confident but too polished. And confidence in this kind of case was often a sign of someone hiding a crack. By noon, I checked in on Evelyn Marsh, the secretary. She was brisk, efficient, and didn't like me poking around. Her story. She left the office at 6, file still in the safe, and went home to Brooklyn where her husband could vouch for her. She said it like she'd repeated it twice already. And then there was Lila Harwood. She was waiting for me in a Fifth Avenue apartment that made me wonder why people even bothered with palaces. Drapes like velvet waterfalls. Art on the walls that probably had insurance agents circling it. And her sitting in a silk robe with her hair done like she'd stepped out of a magazine. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, drawing on a cigarette. "My husband didn't tell me Nero Wolfe was investigating us." "He didn't," I said. "But Miriam Kerrigan did." Her laugh was low and amused. "Of course. Miriam always was dramatic. She offered me a cigarette, which I declined. And what do you think, Mr. Goodwin?" she asked. "Do you think I stole the file?" "I think you had access," I said. "Access," she echoed. "Yes, but interest?" "No, my husband's affairs bore me. I find amusement elsewhere." That was her way of telling me to look at Rodman or Miriam before I looked at her. Which, of course, made me mark her name in ink on my mental list. By the time I got back to the brownstone, my notebook was full of suspects who looked clean, but smelled like mothballs. Wolfe was waiting, lips tight, eyes closed, as though he'd already drawn the map without leaving his chair, and when I reported he smiled faintly, as though the pieces were shifting into place. But that smile faded when Fritz entered with a tray and announced, "Mr. Wolfe, something is missing from the pantry." Wolfe's eyes snapped open. "Missing?" he asked. "Yes," Fritz said. "The jar of saffron. It was there yesterday. This morning, gone, and just like that, the case that had started with a stolen file and a borrowed alibi had trespassed directly into the sanctity of Wolfe's home. Do you want me to keep the momentum going?" Into the next section, where Wolfe treats the pantry, trespass as a turning point, or pause here so you can guide how tightly we focus on the suspects before Wolfe begins pulling strings. Wolfe's eyes went dark when Fritz mentioned the missing saffron, and if you know Wolfe, you know that darkness doesn't come often. Annoyance, yes. Impatience, certainly. But when his sanctum is trespassed upon, it's more than a cook's inconvenience. It's a violation of the order he keeps as carefully as his orchids. "Saffron," Wolfe repeated, voice as cold as January stone. "From the pantry?" "Yes, sir," Fritz said. The jar was half full. "I checked yesterday, when I prepared the bouillabaisse base. This morning it was gone. The lock on the pantry door showed no damage." I glanced at Wolfe. He wasn't staring at Fritz. He was staring past him like the word had activated gears in his head. "Pfui," Wolfe murmured almost to himself. "It begins." "Maybe Fritz just miscounted," I said, though I knew better. Fritz's pantry was as meticulously kept as Wolfe's orchid rooms. A spice jar couldn't vanish by accident. "No," Wolfe said. "This was deliberate." That snapped me a little straighter. "You mean somebody actually got into the brownstone and swiped saffron? Not jewelry, not silverware, but a spice jar?" He lifted one finger. "Not a spice jar, saffron. It is worth more per ounce than gold. Symbolically chosen. And placed here inside my home, it is trespass. An unmistakable declaration. Fritz hovered nervously. Wolfe waved him away with a curt motion, and he left the office with the dignity only Fritz could manage after announcing we'd been burgled by gourmets. I leaned forward. So let's stack this. First, Miriam drops in with a story about a stolen file and a client who wants to drag your name into his alibi. Then I get tailed downtown, and now Saffron disappears from under Fritz's nose. You still think this is just about Harwood's deposition draft? No, Wolfe said firmly. The file is a feint. The true game concerns me. I am being prodded. Prodded into what? Into moving, he said simply. Now Wolfe moving was about as likely as the Empire State Building going for a jog, so the idea someone wanted to shake him loose from his chair was enough to give me the chills. Archie, he said, his eyes narrowing, the man in the brown coat. Saul will identify him. Meanwhile, you will revisit Harwood and inform him politely that the attempt to conscript me has failed. Observe his response, and inquire delicately about Saffron. That last part made me blink. Saffron? You think Harwood's got a kitchen fetish? I think, Wolfe said slowly, that whoever orchestrated this wishes me to see their hand. They left me a message, not a theft. And messages carry signatures. You will discover whose. The next morning, Saul called with his report. Brown overcoat had a name, Leo Cantrell, ex-cop. Tossed out 3 years ago for taking bribes, now freelancing as muscle for anyone with cash. His last few jobs had been quiet tail work for lawyers and businessmen. That tied him neatly to Harwood's sphere. Armed with that, I paid Harwood another visit. His office was busier than before. Phones buzzing, secretaries buzzing louder, and Harwood himself looking like a man trying to steer 6 cars at once with one steering wheel. When he saw me, his smile was thinner this time. Goodwin. Twice in 2 days. Wolfe must be very curious. Curious isn't the word, I said. Try annoyed. He doesn't like his name being used for alibis. Or Saffron disappearing from his pantry. That made him blink. He covered it with a sip of water, but I'd seen the flash of recognition. I don't know what you mean, he said carefully. Don't play dumb, I told him. A jar of saffron vanishes from Wolfe's kitchen, same time your file does from your safe. Somebody's got an expensive taste in groceries. You wouldn't happen to know why, would you? I don't, he said flatly. And if you're here to accuse me, I'm here to warn you, I cut in. If you think dragging Wolfe into this mess will shield you, think again. He doesn't play shield. He plays executioner with words. His jaw tightened. For a moment, the polished charm cracked and something harder showed underneath. Tell Wolfe, he said, low and deliberate, that I have no intention of harming him. If his pantry was disturbed, it has nothing to do with me. And as for the file, there is no file missing. That is final. That is final. Funny, I said. Your lawyer doesn't agree. His lip curled. Miriam talks too much. That was my cue to leave before I said something that would bring security running. On the way out, I spotted Evelyn Marsh at her desk, the secretary, shuffling papers like they were playing cards. She didn't look up, but I noticed the faint trace of saffron yellow powder on her cuff. It could have been a trick of the light, or it could have been something Wolfe would find very tasty indeed. By the time I got back to the brownstone and relayed all this, Wolfe was already chewing on it, mentally, not literally. He leaned back, eyes closed, lips pursed, and let the silence stretch so long I thought he'd drifted off. Then he spoke. Cantrell is Harwood's man, but not Harwood's brain, he said. The theft at the pantry was symbolic, intended for me alone. Miss Marsh's cuff, you say? Looked like saffron dust, I confirmed. Then she carried it, Wolfe said. The question is, did she carry it from Harwood's safe or from my pantry? Either answer is intolerable. Maybe she was just cooking paella, I said, because sarcasm helps when the air gets too heavy. Wolfe ignored that. He reached for the phone. Get Mr. Rodman, Harwood, Miss Marsh, and Mrs. Harwood here tomorrow evening. 8 o'clock. Miss Kerrigan will join them. Archie, you will ensure their attendance. Sure, I said. And when they ask what the meeting's about, tell them, Wolfe said, voice like steel, that their trespass has been noted. That was when I knew this was no longer just a game of missing files. Someone had reached into Wolfe's world, brushed the edge of his order, and left a taunt in saffron. And tomorrow night in this office, he intended to grind that saffron down to dust. But as I looked at him, silent and immovable in his chair, I couldn't help thinking that whoever planned this knew exactly how to make Nero Wolfe move without leaving his seat. And that thought, I admit, made me uneasy. Do you want me to carry the tension straight into the next development, the pressure mounting as the suspects prepare for Wolfe's summons, or would you like me to slow down and deepen the dynamics between Miriam, Harwood, and the others before the office gathering? By the next afternoon, I'd already earned enough grey hairs to demand a bonus. Not that Wolfe would ever consider such nonsense. Herding 4 suspects and 1 lawyer into Wolfe's office for an evening rendezvous is the sort of task that makes me wish the brownstone had a revolving door. Each had their excuse, their suspicion, or their indignation, but Wolfe had spoken, and Wolfe's summons carries a peculiar gravitational pull. You don't orbit away from it for long. Rodman was the first call I made. He groaned like I'd just asked him to donate a kidney, then reluctantly agreed, though he made sure to tell me he was very busy with clients. I told him he'd be busier if Wolfe had to fetch him personally, which shut him up. Evelyn Marsh tried to claim she was needed at the office late, but when I mentioned the saffron, there was silence sharp enough to slice bread before she agreed. Lila Harwood was easier. She purred into the phone like a cat, invited to watch the canary cage. Grant Harwood himself took the longest to pin down, but eventually even he surrendered to Wolfe's demand. And Miriam Kerrigan, though tight-lipped, said she would be present, her voice carrying a note of resignation, as though she'd known this moment was inevitable. By 8 o'clock sharp, the brownstone felt less like a sanctuary and more like the waiting room for judgment. Wolfe sat in his chair, massive and still, wearing the look of a man who knew exactly how the evening would unfold, but preferred to let the rest of us stumble toward it. I hovered near my desk, notebook at the ready, while Fritz made the kind of coffee you'd swear was brewed with solemn rites. They arrived one by one. Rodman first, scowling, then Evelyn, who looked pale but controlled. Miriam came next, calm as the morning she first stormed in. Lila followed, in another silk creation that suggested she'd rather be at the opera, but was curious enough to indulge Wolfe. And finally, Harwood himself, jaw set, smile absent, eyes darting like a man walking into a trap he couldn't see but felt in his bones. Wolfe waited until they were all seated in the rows of chairs I'd set up, then opened his eyes fully. That alone seemed to press the room into silence. "You are here," he began, his voice heavy but calm, "because one among you presumes to involve me in a sordid deception, a file supposedly stolen, an alibi forged in my name, and, most egregious, an intrusion upon this house. My pantry has been disturbed." Lila raised her brows. "Saffron?" she murmured, amusement flickering. "Yes," Wolfe said without glancing at her. "Saffron. Not trivial, madam. The act was not theft but trespass, a signal, and I intend to know whose hand sent it." Rodman gave a short, scornful laugh. "You think any of us broke into your kitchen to swipe spices? This is ridiculous." Wolfe's eyes shifted, pinning him. "How you protest too swiftly, Mr. Rodman. Be still." That silenced Rodman as effectively as a gag. Evelyn Marsh fidgeted, fingers tightening on her handbag. Harwood sat stiff, lips pressed, while Miriam leaned slightly forward as though determined not to miss a word. Lila crossed her legs and exhaled smoke in a lazy curl, unfazed. "Archie," Wolfe said, "you will relate your observations." So I did. I told them about Harwood's denials, about Rodman's alibi at the Stuyvesant Club, about Evelyn's insistence she left the office at 6, about Lila's claim of disinterest in her husband's affairs. And I described the tail in the brown coat, Cantrell, whose name tied him neatly back to Harwood. Finally, I added the saffron dust I'd seen on Evelyn's cuff. The room reacted as expected. Evelyn flushed. Harwood stiffened. Miriam's lips tightened. Lila smiled faintly, and Rodman swore under his breath. "That is slander," Evelyn snapped at me. "No," Wolfe said flatly. "It is observation. The explanation for it lies with you." "I cook at home," she said quickly, her voice trembling only slightly. "It must have been that." "Convenient," Wolfe murmured, "and yet implausible. The powder was fresh. You had left your office. Why linger with saffron at your sleeve unless you carried it recently?" Evelyn's eyes darted toward Harwood before she caught herself. It was brief, but it was there, and I caught it like a fly in amber. Wolfe saw it too. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe continued, "the missing file and the vanished saffron are not isolated. Both are levers. The file leverages Harwood's reputation. The saffron leverages mine. Both were meant to corner us into reaction. The question is, whose game is it?" Rodman leaned forward, voice sharp. "If you're accusing me, I accuse no one yet, Wolfe cut in. But I will. Each of you has motive. Mr. Harwood, desperate to conceal the contents of a deposition draft. Miss Marsh, loyal perhaps but fearful, and thus pliable. Mr. Rodman, bound to Harwood by profit and rivalry alike. Mrs. Harwood, disdainful of her husband's affairs and hungry for her own diversions. And Miss Kerrigan, who stands to rise or fall depending on whether her client triumphs or collapses. The silence that followed was thick enough to carve. No one dared speak, perhaps waiting for Wolfe to finish gutting them one by one. Then Miriam broke it. You mean to say any of us could have orchestrated both thefts? But which? What is your evidence? My evidence, Wolfe said, is embryonic. Tonight I do not reveal. Tonight, I observe, you will all go about your affairs, knowing that your lies have been registered. Archie will continue his legwork. Saul Panzer will continue his watch. And when I am ready, I will summon you again, not for questions, but for judgment. That was Wolfe's way of dismissing a room, and dismiss it he did. Rodman stormed out first, muttering curses under his breath. Evelyn followed, pale and shaken, gripping her bag like it might save her. Miriam left in silence, her face unreadable. Lila lingered just long enough to blow a stream of smoke toward Wolfe before gliding out, while Harwood paused at the door, glared at Wolfe with a look of pure loathing, then followed his wife. When the door closed behind them, Wolfe leaned back, eyes slipping shut again. Archie, he said softly, we are very near. Near what? I asked. Exposure, he said. But not yet. Tonight they show their cracks. Tomorrow we widen them. I exhaled, rubbed the back of my neck and thought about the saffron, a jar of spice stolen not for flavor, but for message. Wolfe was right. It was a declaration, a gauntlet tossed at his feet. Whoever sent it thought they could rattle him. But as I watched him sit there, still as stone, I knew rattling Wolfe was a mistake. The real trouble would be when he decided to strike back. Strike back. Would you like me to continue with the pressure escalating? The second trespass or betrayal that forces Wolfe to tighten his net, or deepen the legwork first, with Archie pressing suspects harder before Wolfe sharpens the knife. The brownstone always feels different after Wolfe has emptied it of suspects. You'd think the air would clear, but instead it thickens, like the walls themselves have absorbed the lies and aren't done whispering them back. I shut the door behind Harwood and his entourage and waited for Wolfe to say something, but he sat with his eyes closed, hands folded across his middle, as if the whole exercise had been no more than a particularly dull opera. Not exactly a standing ovation, I said, loosening my tie. Rodman's ready to punch the next wall he sees. Evelyn looked like she'd faint if someone sneezed. Harwood's about 2 steps from hiring Cantrell to come strangle me. Miriam's either guilty or a saint, and Lila, well, she looked like she was enjoying the show. Not bad for one evening. Wolfe exhaled slowly, like a man cooling soup. They revealed themselves. Enough for now, I waited. That was as much of a cue as I was going to get. Revealed what? That each has tension with the others. It is the tension I need, Archie. Truth is pliant, but tension snaps. You will pull tomorrow until one of them breaks. Who's first? Miss Marsh, he said. Her sleeve betrayed her, and her eyes followed Harwood. Pressure her subtly. A secretary is often the fulcrum of a household of deceit. Delicately, huh? I muttered. I'll bring flowers. That earned me silence, which from Wolfe meant either contempt or concentration. With him it was usually both. I left him to it, spent a few minutes in the kitchen reassuring Fritz that saffron thefts weren't going to topple civilization, and turned in. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept seeing that flicker in Evelyn's glance toward Harwood, like a compass needle pointing north, even when it wanted to spin elsewhere. The next morning I caught her before she reached the office, waiting outside the building where Harwood and Rodman's empire made its nest. She jumped when she saw me, which told me she had every reason to. Miss Marsh, I said lightly, what a coincidence. I was just in the neighborhood. Thought you and I might take a stroll. I'm late, she stammered. Good, I said. Then you'll walk fast. She gave in, heels clicking, and we cut through a quieter side street. I kept the tone conversational. You looked uncomfortable last night, she flushed. Anyone would, being accused like that. Accused? I asked. Funny, I didn't hear Wolfe accuse anyone. He just laid out facts. And when he mentioned saffron, your face went pale. Now why would saffron make you nervous? Her steps faltered. It didn't. I told you I cook at home. Try again, I said, my voice sharpening. Because if you really think Nero Wolfe believes you tracked saffron into his office from your kitchen in Brooklyn, you've got a dim view of reality. You had contact with that spice recently. Where? She looked around like she expected Cantrell to leap from a doorway. I can't, she whispered. You can't or you won't. Her hands trembled, clutching her bag. Mr. Goodwin, please. You don't know what they'll do if I talk. That told me plenty. I slowed my pace, softened my tone. Who's they? Harwood, Rodman? Her lips pressed tight, but the fear in her eyes screamed an answer she wouldn't voice. Listen, I said quietly. You don't have to tell me everything now. Just this. Was it Harwood who had you move that saffron into the brownstone? Or was it Rodman? She stopped dead, staring at me like I'd just peeled back the skin of her thoughts. I never entered your house, she said finally, voice shaking. I swear it. But I handled saffron. For Mr. Harwood, he asked me to purchase it. Special order. I didn't know why. That was enough for me to feel the ground shift. She bolted into the building before I could press further, leaving me with a fresh knot to bring Wolfe. When I reported, Wolfe's eyes narrowed. So Harwood employed her to buy saffron, ostensibly for himself. Yet saffron appears in my pantry. Ergo he wishes me to know his hand or wishes me to believe it. Then Harwood planted it. I asked, perhaps. Or he directed. But why? To rattle you, I said. You already said that. Wolfe shook his head. Not merely to rattle. To declare himself, yes, but also to obscure another hand. If Harwood wishes me to think him the trespasser, then perhaps he is not. He may be both liar and pawn. That was the kind of logic that made my head hurt, but I wrote it down anyway. By late afternoon, Saul checked in. He'd tailed Cantrell, who had indeed been shadowing Harwood's office, but also made a side trip, straight to the Stuyvesant Club. The very same place Rodman claimed to be playing bridge during the time the file vanished. Saul had watched him slip into a back room and emerge 20 minutes later, with a man matching Rodman's description. I took that upstairs fast. Wolfe listened, drumming his thick fingers against the arm of the chair. Archie, you see the lattice now. Harwood denies theft. Rodman produces an alibi, supported perhaps by Cantrell, a man in his pay. Miss Marsh is instructed to procure saffron, which is then planted here, and Mrs. Harwood floats above it all, mocking, immune, while Miss Kerrigan ties herself to me in her bid for professional survival. Which means what? Which means, Wolfe said, we are on the brink of coercion. Someone wishes me to choose a side. I will not. Instead, I will choose the truth. That sounded neat enough, but before I could press him, the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting Saul again. Instead, it was Miriam Kerrigan. Her voice was tight, urgent. Mr. Goodwin, you have to come now, it's Harwood. He's been attacked, I stiffened. Attacked how? She hesitated. Not killed, but beaten. He's at his townhouse. He asked for me, and I thought Wolfe should know. When I hung up, Wolfe had already opened his eyes. Go, he said. See, report, and be cautious. The noose tightens, so I went. And as I rode downtown to Harwood's place, I couldn't shake the thought that Wolfe's sanctuary had already been trespassed once, and Harwood's broken face might be the second message. Whoever was orchestrating this wasn't done yet, and if Wolfe was right, the true trespass was still to come. Do you want me to carry the thread directly into Harwood's townhouse, the aftermath of the attack, deepening the suspicion, or pause and let Wolfe begin setting his final snare in the brownstone? Harwood's townhouse was one of those brownstones that had been sandblasted into respectability, the kind of place where money didn't just live, it held court. But when I rang the bell and Miriam Kerrigan let me in, the scene inside didn't look like Money's kingdom. It looked like Money had just lost a bar fight. Harwood was slumped in an armchair with an ice pack pressed against his cheek, his tie loosened, and his shirt collar stained with blood. His square jaw looked less like the kind that sold razor blades, and more like the kind that had been on the wrong end of a boot. He glanced up when I entered, eyes sharp despite the swelling. Goodwin, he muttered. Come to gloat? I don't gloat, I said, stepping closer. I observe. And right now I'm observing that somebody tuned you up good. Care to share who? Miriam hovered behind him, lips tight. She'd been trying to play nurse, but looked more like she wanted to strangle him herself. Harwood shifted the ice pack. 2 men, masks, broke in around 7, said nothing. Just fists, left me with a warning. What kind of warning? He winced as he leaned forward. That Wolfe should stay out of it. That if he didn't, it would get worse. And it would get worse. That made me pause. I'd heard a lot of warnings in my line, but most of them aimed at me or occasionally Wolfe, when someone thought they had enough muscle to scare him. But sending thugs to beat up a client just to deliver a message for Wolfe, that was a new twist. You're telling me, I said slowly, that whoever jumped you didn't care about you. They just used you to make Wolfe sit down and shut up. Harwood's lip curled. That's what I said. I crouched beside him close enough to catch the bitterness in his breath. And why would Wolfe's involvement matter so much to anyone, unless the missing file is a bigger deal than you've been claiming? If it's just misplaced, why the fists? His jaw worked, but he didn't answer. Miriam's voice cut in, sharp and tired, because he's lying. The file was stolen, and someone is desperate enough to make sure Wolfe never finds out who took it. Harwood barked a short, ugly laugh. You think you're clever, Miriam, but you're not. You've dragged Wolfe into this circus because you want him to do your dirty work. Now look what it's cost. She bristled, but I stepped between them before the air got hotter than it already was. Save the squabbling, I said. What matters is this. Somebody thinks they can scare Wolfe off. That's about as likely as scaring off the Statue of Liberty. But if you really want him out, Harwood, all you have to do is tell me the truth. Who had reason to grab that file? Rodman, Marsh? Your wife. That last one landed like a punch. Harwood's eyes flicked just for a second, before he forced them back to me. My wife, he said bitterly, wouldn't know one legal document from another. She barely knows me. Still, I said, she had access. His lips pressed together, and the silence said more than any denial. Miriam folded her arms, her eyes drilling into him, but he wouldn't give her or me anything more. I straightened. Fine, don't tell me. But Wolfe will drag it out of you sooner or later. And when he does, it'll hurt more than a couple of thugs with fists. On the way out, Miriam stopped me at the door. Do you see now? This isn't about a missing file anymore. It's about control. Whoever is behind this wants Wolfe's silence. They fear him more than they fear exposure. That tells you what you need to know. Maybe, I said, but fear makes people sloppy. And Wolfe's specialty is sweeping up after sloppiness. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe didn't need me to dramatize. He took one look at my face and knew Harwood hadn't given much. When I relayed the details, his lips tightened. They beat him not to punish, but to instruct me. Phooey, that was foolish. It presumes I can be instructed. Who do you think signed the order? I asked. Rodman had Cantrell. That links him to muscle. But the brutality... Wolfe's eyes narrowed. The brutality suggests desperation. Desperation is Harwood's, yet Harwood benefits least from silencing me unless... He trailed off, lost in thought. Unless what? I prodded. Unless he fears not the file, but the revelation of his reliance upon me. He dreads exposure, Archie. And desperation makes men hire thugs. That was reasonable, but the picture still felt foggy. And what about Evelyn Marsh? She swears she never entered the brownstone, but she bought saffron for Harwood. That's too neat. Indeed, Wolfe said. She is a conduit. Harwood uses her hands to shield his own. If saffron entered my pantry, it did so by her carrying, but at his behest. Yet her fear was genuine. She is not the architect. She is a pawn. Then who's the architect? He opened his eyes, heavy and sharp. His wife. That startled me enough to blink. Lila? She barely even pretends to care. Few saw her, lounging like Cleopatra, amused by the whole circus. Precisely, Wolfe said. Amusement is armor. She mocks because she knows more than she reveals. And Harwood's glance when you pressed him, did you not see it? I saw it, I admitted. But if she took the file, what does saffron have to do with her? That, Wolfe said softly, is what we shall determine. The phone rang then, jolting the room. I answered. It was Saul. His voice was low, deliberate. Archie, you'd better tell Wolfe. Cantrell's on the move again. But this time he wasn't watching you. He was watching the brownstone. I felt the chill crawl up my neck. How close? Close enough to check the locks. When I hung up and told Wolfe, his face darkened in a way I'd only seen twice before. Archie, he said, his voice like iron. This has gone far enough. Tomorrow evening all of them return here. Harwood, Rodman, Marsh, Lila, and Miss Kerrigan. This time I end it. His hand closed around his beer glass, steady as stone, and I realized something. The trespasses had succeeded in stirring Wolfe, but not the way their sender intended. They hadn't frightened him. They'd provoked him, and that meant tomorrow night someone was going to find out what it felt like to be dismantled by words sharper than any blade. And if I knew Wolfe, he already had the knife sharpened. Would you like me to continue directly into the climactic office gathering, where Wolfe dismantles them one by one, or would you prefer a slower build showing Archie's final legwork before the trap is sprung? The next day dawned with the kind of heavy quiet that only comes before a storm, the kind you feel in your bones even before the clouds roll in. Wolfe spent the morning upstairs among the orchids, refusing interruptions, and Fritz and I kept to our own rhythms, though the brownstone itself felt taut, expectant. By evening it would be a theatre, and Wolfe the only director who mattered. I used the time to do my part. Saul had Cantrell under observation, and though the ex-cop loitered near the brownstone again, he hadn't dared a second trespass. I swung by Harwood's office under pretense of checking on Evelyn, but what I really wanted was to watch them in daylight before Wolfe gathered them again. Harwood's jaw was still bruised, his temper raw. Rodman gave me a look that could peel paint, but said nothing. Evelyn flinched when I said good morning, and Lila, when I spotted her stepping out of a taxi, smiled at me with the kind of amusement that said she thought the whole world was a parlor game. Every one of them was wound tight, and none of them would admit it. Perfect fodder for Wolfe. By 7:30 I was back at the brownstone, setting the chairs in their half-circle before Wolfe's desk. The ritual mattered. He liked his suspects arranged just so, with himself looming like a mountain and me flanking as the irreverent but necessary translator. Fritz brought in the good coffee, rich and black, set it on the side table and vanished without a word. Even he knew this evening required silence. At 8 sharp they began to arrive. First Miriam, punctual as law itself, her eyes steady but anxious. Then Rodman, scowling and muttering about wasted time. Evelyn next, pale and tight-lipped, clutching her bag as though it were a life raft. Harwood followed, still sore from his beating, bitterness hanging off him like a second coat. And finally Lila, shimmering in silk again, drifting into the office as though it were her private stage. Wolfe didn't speak until all were seated, his hands folded across his great middle, eyes closed as if he might have been dozing. Then he opened them and the room froze. "You return," he said evenly, "because I require truth. You may not value it, but I do, and tonight we reach its marrow," Rodman huffed. "If this is another performance about spices—" "Be silent," Wolfe said, not raising his voice but cutting Rodman off like a guillotine. "You will speak when addressed." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Wolfe leaned forward slightly. The theft of a file was the prelude, the use of my name as an alibi, the chorus. Add the trespass into my pantry, the crescendo. Each of you has tried to bend circumstance to your advantage. But it is done. Tonight the pretense ends. He shifted his gaze to Evelyn. "Miss Marsh, you purchased saffron." "For whom?" Her lips trembled. "For Mr. Harwood, he asked me. I didn't know why." Wolfe nodded once. "And then the saffron appears in my pantry." "You did not place it there, as I swear I didn't," she cried, clutching her bag tighter. "Indeed, you were used. A pawn, as I said, but pawns are useful in revealing the hands that move them." His gaze moved to Harwood, who stiffened under it. "Mr. Harwood, your deposition draft was taken. You deny it. You claim accident, yet you employ Cantrell to shadow my assistant. You direct Miss Marsh to buy saffron, and then you are beaten in your home. Too many contradictions." "I told you," Harwood snapped. "I didn't take the file." "I don't know who did." "Oh, you lie," Wolfe said calmly. "But your lie is not the theft. Your lie is protection. You conceal not the file's loss, but your wife's hand." That made the room jolt. Lila laughed, low and throaty. "My hand? Really, Mr. Wolfe, what a delicious story. What would I want with some dreary legal file?" "Power," Wolfe said. "The file contained testimony that could destroy your husband's business. With it gone, you hold the sword over him. You could expose him or shield him, as whim dictates. And you salted the stage with saffron to taunt me, to make me bristle. You knew Wolfe's sanctuary would not abide intrusion, and thus you forced him to act. You wanted me to turn my gaze on Harwood, to strip him bare." Her smile faltered, just a fraction. Rodman leaned forward. "That's insane." "Lila wouldn't—" "She would," Wolfe said, "and she did. Cantrell's presence at the Stuyvesant Club was not for you, Mr. Rodman. It was to distract, to weave confusion. And the thugs who beat Harwood did not come from Rodman's purse, but from hers. She could pay them easily. Her disdain masked desperation. Desperation to break free of her husband while securing control of his fortune. Miriam's eyes widened. You mean she orchestrated all of it? Yes, Wolfe said. The theft, the saffron, the threats. But she miscalculated. She presumed that rattling me would obscure her hand. Instead, it illuminated it. Only she stood to profit on every front. Her husband weakened, his lawyer discredited, his partner implicated, his secretary frightened into silence. And Wolfe drawn into the fray, lending her scheme credibility. For a moment, no one moved. Then Harwood lurched to his feet, face mottled with rage and humiliation. Lila, he spat. She stayed seated, calm again, eyes glittering. Oh, don't look so shocked, Grant. You've lied and cheated your way through every deal you ever made. I simply played better. He started toward her, fists clenched, but I stepped in fast, planting a hand on his chest. Sit down, or you'll have more than a bruised jaw. He sank back into his chair, seething. Lila crossed her legs, lit a cigarette, and blew smoke toward the ceiling. Wolfe exhaled, final and conclusive. You will, of course, face the law's attentions. I will not dirty my house with further trespass. Archie, see them out. Miss Kerrigan, you may pursue remedies as your profession dictates. And just like that, the storm broke. Rodman bolted without a word, Evelyn near tears. Harwood stumbled after them, muttering curses. Miriam lingered, thanking Wolfe with a nod before following. Lila was the last to rise, her silk robe whispering as she stood. She looked at Wolfe with a smile that was almost admiration. You're right, she said softly. I underestimated you. But you should know, Nero Wolfe, I don't regret it. Not one bit. Then she glided out, leaving the scent of her perfume to hang like smoke in the air. When the door closed, silence filled the room. Wolfe reached for his beer, took a long, deliberate sip and set it down. Archie, he said, it is extraordinary how often folly disguises itself as cunning. Humanity is consistent in that, at least. Sure, I said, loosening my tie again. But you have to admit she put on a good show, he grunted. A tawdry one. Fritz will serve dinner. That will be the only worthwhile conclusion to this day. And just like that, order returned to the brownstone. Outside, the city would churn with lawyers and policemen and angry husbands, but inside it was saffron and lamb, orchids and silence. Another storm had come and gone, and Wolfe hadn't moved an inch, except, of course, in the minds of everyone who had dared to trespass. I leaned back in my chair, watching him sip his beer, and couldn't help grinning. Well, boss, at least this time nobody accused you of betting on the third race at Belmont. He closed his eyes. Phooey. And with that, the curtain fell. Would you like me to write the final aftermath section, a quieter coda that ties together Wolfe's philosophy, Archie's reflections, and the return of peace in the brownstone, or keep the story concluded here? Dinner that night was as deliberate as everything else in Wolfe's life. Fritz served a braised lamb shoulder with saffron rice, a deliberate choice, and one I couldn't help but grin at when the plate landed in front of Wolfe. If Fritz had meant it as irony, Wolfe gave no sign. He dug in with his usual ritual, lifting forkfuls with the solemnity of a priest at the altar. I sat across waiting, because I knew he'd talk when he was ready. Wolfe never left a case hanging in silence forever. For him, the unraveling wasn't complete until he had not only exposed the culprit, but filed it neatly in the cabinet of his own moral code. And judging by the way his eyes narrowed with each sip of beer, he was composing tonight's entry. At last he set his fork down, dabbed his lips with his napkin, and leaned back. Archie, he said, I detest trespass. Noted, I replied, spearing a forkful of rice. I had the impression you weren't exactly fond of it. This was not simply a theft, nor merely deception. It was intrusion into order, my order. A woman's ambition might excuse many things, but to violate one's sanctuary is not ambition. It is insolence. Lila Harwood wanted leverage over her husband, I said. She got clever, tried to throw you in the middle as a way to break him. You broke her instead. End of story. Wolfe made a face. Not quite. She believed herself superior to the institutions that hold society together. Law, contract, even marriage. Her arrogance was her undoing. That and her underestimation of me. What is instructive, Archie, is not her failure but the inevitability of it. Pride masquerades as cunning, but it is always pride. That's a nice sermon, I said. But tell me something, was Harwood really that much of a victim? He hired Cantrell, played games with the saffron, kept Miriam in the dark. He wasn't exactly innocent. Innocence is irrelevant, Wolfe said, eyes half closed. Harwood is venal, Rodman self-serving, Miss Marsh timid. Each had flaws, but the orchestration was hers alone. The symphony was hers. The others played merely as instruments. I sat back, letting that settle. He had a way of shrinking people down to their essential flaws, cutting them to size until they fit neat on his shelves. I'd seen plenty of guilty men squirm under his logic, but Lila Harwood's calm, mocking smile at the end, that stuck with me. Funny thing, I said, she didn't seem broken, not even rattled. Almost like she expected you to win and she just wanted to watch how you'd do it. She is frivolous, Wolfe said. Her amusement is another mask. The law will strip it. Maybe, I said, but she'll make headlines first. Rich wife sabotages husband's empire, manipulates lawyer, taunts Nero Wolfe with saffron. The papers are going to have a field day. Phooey, Wolfe muttered, lifting his beer. Let them. Public appetite is as vulgar as it is insatiable. I will not be made their entertainment. Their entertainment. I let him have that one, though I knew tomorrow's papers would mention him whether he liked it or not. People love a story where the fat man in the brownstone unmasks the cunning socialite. And if saffron made it into the headlines, Fritz would never live it down at the grocer's. When the plates were cleared, Wolfe excused himself to his orchids, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the brownstone. I poured myself a drink and leaned back, replaying the day. The thugs, the tale, the saffron dust, the office showdown, it had all been theatre leading to the inevitable curtain Wolfe always draws. But what stuck with me most wasn't the reveal, it was the message behind it. They'd tried to rattle Wolfe, they'd invaded his sanctuary, and that was a mistake I wouldn't wish on anyone. He was immovable, unshakable, but not untouchable. Tonight he'd proven again that the best way to fight a battle was never to leave your chair. Around 11, I heard him come down from the plant rooms. He didn't come back into the office, just paused in the hall. Archie, he said, his voice low, almost reflective. "Yeah, boss?" There is an order to life. Men and women may twist it, soil it, mock it, but in the end, it asserts itself, as it did tonight. Remember that. Then he vanished into his room without another word. I sat there, drink in hand, and thought about it. Order, he'd said. For Wolfe, order was orchids and beer, words and logic. For me, it was action and observation, questions and quips. Between us, we'd restored balance to a little corner of the world, though tomorrow the city would wake to another storm. I finished the drink, turned off the lights and climbed the stairs. Outside, the city never slept. But inside the brownstone, the world was back where Wolfe liked it. Still, precise, untrespassed. And if saffron ever went missing again, heaven help the fool who thought it was just a spice. The morning after the showdown, the brownstone felt oddly lighter, like a weight had been lifted from its walls. Fritz was humming in the kitchen, tending to eggs and bacon, and the orchids upstairs had their caretaker back in full. As for Wolfe, he was in his chair, wide awake, sipping his first beer of the day and looking as if the world had finally stopped being an imposition. The newspapers confirmed what we both knew would happen. Lila Harwood's arrest made the front page, her photograph stealing the spotlight from her husband's bruised face. The headlines loved her, the glamorous wife with silk robes and silkier lies brought down not by scandal alone, but by Nero Wolfe's unshakable deductions. I tossed the paper onto Wolfe's desk. Well, you're a star again. Society wives everywhere will be double-locking their spice cabinets. He grunted without looking at it. Ephemeral notoriety. Phooey. You could at least enjoy it, I said. After all, it's not every day someone tries to drag your name through the mud with saffron and thugs. You cracked it, boss, and you never left your chair. He lifted his eyes, and there was a faint gleam in them. Not pride, exactly, but the satisfaction of order restored. I did nothing but reveal what was already obvious. She wished to enthrall me with her bravado, but she erred. She presumed herself clever when she was merely audacious. Audacity without intellect is always doomed. Still, I said, pouring myself coffee, I've got to hand it to her. She played everyone around her like a fiddle. Husband, partner, secretary, even Miriam for a while. If you hadn't stepped in, she might have walked away holding all the strings. And strangled herself with them, Wolfe said firmly. In the end, Archie, truth is not a choice. It asserts itself. She believed she could wield deception like a sword. Instead, it cut her. I leaned against the desk, sipping coffee, watching him settle back into silence. Cases always ended this way, with Wolfe dissecting the folly of humanity and me keeping the mood from getting too heavy. So, I said, what's today's moral lesson? Don't marry rich if you can't keep your spice rack locked? His lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. The lesson, Archie, is that appetite is inevitable. For food, for power, for control. Appetite blinds as often as it sustains. Those who indulge without limit will always be consumed in turn. I raised my cup. Well, here's to appetite then. Long as Fritz keeps feeding ours, I figure we'll survive the storm. He closed his eyes, folded his hands over his middle, and sighed. Phooey. You and your quips. The house fell into its familiar rhythm. Outside, the world buzzed about the Harwoods, the missing file, the glamorous wife-turned-schemer. But inside, the brownstone was whole again. The orchids thrived upstairs. The kitchen smelled of garlic and butter, and Wolfe sat unmoved, a monument to logic and order. Another trespass repelled, another storm weathered, and me, I was ready for the next one.